Amen. Grab a seat this morning. Again, it's so good to see you here. Glad that you're joining us. This is week number 3 of our 4-week teaching series called At the Core. Now, over the course of this series, we're looking at 3 distinct values, 3 things that are just at the core, at the center of everything that we do and we believe here as a local congregation at Level 13. We want this to be known. We want everyone that walks in the door, everyone who hears anything about Level 13 to know that these are 3 key components for who we are and what we're about. And in that very first week, we said this was kind of an overarching theme for the entire series. What we value, we repeat. The things that are important to us, we repeat those over and over and over again. I made the joke about I get up and drink coffee in the morning because it makes me like people better and people like me better. If I didn't do that in the morning, nobody would want to be around me. And I probably wouldn't want to be around anybody else either. So what I value interaction with people. I value being kind to people. And so there's caffeine that goes in my system to help me with that. But as a church family, there are certain things that we just value, certain things that are important to us. The first 2 weeks, we've looked at the word connection. That has been our core value, connection. And we started in that very first week. We said that we want to be intentional and create space for people to meet Jesus. We want people to have an opportunity who walk in our doors, who either they're far from God, they've never had a relationship with Jesus, they're still questioning if they believe this whole Jesus thing or not, or they once had a relationship with him, but they kind of turned and walked away. We want anyone who walks in this room to have an opportunity to meet Jesus, to connect with him. And so we intentionally create space for people to connect with Jesus. Last week, we continued that conversation and said we also want to intentionally create space for people to connect with one another. We said that we just we weren't created to do life alone. We were created to live in community, to be in relationship with other people. And so last week we started the process of revamping small groups, and we will be launching those as time goes on, just a little bit down the road. And if you turned in a Connect card saying that you were willing to either be a part of a small group or host a small group at your home or lead a small group, thank you so much for that. If you didn't get a chance to do that, it's not too late. We're still working on that. So you just fill out a Connect card this morning, drop it in the black box or hand it to someone this morning on your way out and say, hey, I'm interested in groups. I'm interested in leading a group. I'm interested in just hosting a group in my home, but I don't want to lead. Whatever you feel led to do by the Holy Spirit, I want to encourage you to do that. But we believe that there are these key components. Connection was our first key component, was our first value. This morning, we're going to talk about the second value. That second value is worship. Worship is at the core value that we have as a group of believers, as a body of believers. It's something that is incredibly important to us as a church family. Now, anyone who has been around this area for any length of time knows that one of the things that Level 13 has always been known for is just some incredible worship, incredible music and singers. That's something that is just well known. I mean, in fact, it was one of the first things that we heard about the church before we ever came up here to interview. And so that's something that is well known. But worship, it goes beyond just having men and women who are gifted to sing or play an instrument. Worship is so much more than that. It is so much more important, so much more vital to our lives as followers of Jesus than just having a good group of people who can play and sing. That's important, but it's not the main thing. So this morning, as we dive into this conversation about worship, I want you to think about 3 questions. I want you to wrestle through 3 questions. First, is worship important? Is worship an important thing? Number 2, why do we sing and engage in worship at church? Why do we do those things? And number 3, if worship is important, what does it accomplish? I want you to wrestle through those 3 questions. As we talk through this, we're going to try and answer these 3 questions about worship. And I believe one of the greatest places that we can go to figure this out is we can actually take a look in the Jewish scriptures that make up our Old Testament. There's this story tucked away in 2 Chronicles. It's one of those books that we have to intentionally go to because nobody just flips open, I'm going to read 2 Chronicles today. Very few people do that. So you have to intentionally go there. If you do, hey, that's awesome for you. That's not one of my go-to places. I'll just put it that way. But in 2 Chronicles, there's the story of this king of Judah named Jehoshaphat. I think I would probably change my name because I'm already self-conscious about fat. I don't want that as my name. I would have changed my name. Just call me Joe. That would have been me, but he didn't do that. He was comfortable in his own skin. So Jehoshaphat was the great grandson of King David. This guy reigned in Judah for 25 years. He was a godly king. He led the kingdom incredibly well. But he also faced an incredible battle. This particular time that we see Jehoshaphat, he is surrounded by 3 invading armies. You have the army of Moab and the army of Ammon and the army of Seir. These 3 nations have come together and they've just decided we want to wipe Judah off the face of the planet. We want to get rid of them and we're going to come together and we're going to do this. Jehoshaphat had a huge decision to make. Every eye in the nation was on him. Every eye in the nation was waiting to see, and every ear was waiting to hear. What are you going to do? How are we going to handle this situation? And so Jehoshaphat started in a great place. He started by praying and fasting. He started by seeking the face of God. God, what do you want us to do in this situation? But what he did next was so unorthodox. It was so random. It was so weird. No one in their right mind would ever think this is where we need to go. If you have a Bible or a Bible app on your device, we're going to take a look again at 2 Chronicles chapter 20. We'll have it on the screen for you as well. Jehoshaphat talked to the people. He had prayed, he had fasted, and he had heard from God. And then here he begins to make his decision. So 2 Chronicles chapter 20. After consulting the people, the king appointed singers to walk ahead of the army, singing to the Lord and praising him for his holy splendor. This is what they sang: "Give thanks to the Lord, for his faithful love endures forever." Now, total transparency here. I've never been in the military. I know you couldn't tell that by looking at me, but I've never been in the military. The closest I've ever been to a military just part of my life is playing a video game with military stuff in it when I was a kid. That's the closest I've ever been. So unless you want to count that, I have no military expertise whatsoever. But even as limited as my military expertise may be, I think sending singers out to walk in front of the army is about the most ridiculous thing that you could ever do. It accomplishes 2 things. First, you're sending out unarmed people as the first line of your defense. And I'm no military strategist, but I would just think I would want to send out some of my stronger warriors to go in and kind of get me an early advantage. But no, Jehoshaphat said, I'm going to send out unarmed people, and they're going to be the first ones to engage this enemy. Secondly, they're going to sing, which immediately tells your enemy right where you are. I mean, you have completely taken away this whole stealth attack, the element of surprise. Now everyone knows you're coming. They know where you're coming from, and you don't have anybody that's armed in front. This makes no sense whatsoever. And yet, it was the greatest decision that Jehoshaphat could make. Verse 22. At the very moment they began to sing and give praise to the Lord caused the armies of Ammon, Moab, and Seir to start fighting among themselves. I think the word choice there is really interesting. At the very moment, not a little bit later, not there was this lag that took place, but at the very moment that these singers began to sing praises to God saying, God, you are good. Your faithful love endures forever. God, you are awesome. I worship you. I praise you. God, you are great. At the very moment that began, these three invading enemies started fighting one another. You can see in verse 23 that Moab and Ammon, they ganged up on Seir. And then once they had annihilated all of them, they decided, you know what? Hey, we've kind of got a bloodlust going on. Let's just go ahead and kill each other. And so that's what took place. And we see in verse 24, so when the army of Judah arrived at the lookout point in the wilderness, all they saw were dead bodies lying on the ground as far as they could see. Not a single one of the enemy had escaped. Wow. What a story. What a just a testament to what worship really is. I want to say it this way. Our worship is warfare. Jehoshaphat knew that. He understood that worship isn't just singing songs. It isn't just a time slot filler on Sunday mornings. It isn't just an opportunity for the men and women and students this morning, which was awesome to see, on stage singing and leading worship. It isn't just an opportunity to give these guys and gals who are gifted a chance to use their gifts. That's a benefit. But that's not the purpose. That's not the point. The point is worship is warfare. Worship is something that we do in the natural that causes things to happen in the supernatural that we can't see yet. Worship is an opportunity for you and for me to fight a battle that we have no chance of winning. It looks like we're surrounded. It looks like we're outnumbered. It looks as if there is no hope. But in the midst of that no hope surrounded moment, we can lift our hands and we can lift our voice and we can sing, God, you are good. This doesn't make sense. God, everything in me wants to say that I just need to figure this out, that I need to recruit some people to come and help me fight this battle, but I'm going to choose to worship you instead. And as I worship you, as I sing to the God who is great and greatly to be praised, something happens in the supernatural. There's something that happens in the spirit that we can't explain. Jehoshaphat couldn't explain what took place. All he knew was they showed up to the lookout and there's dead bodies everywhere. This army that wanted to destroy them was no more. Worship is at the core of what we do at Level 13 because every single week there are men, women, students, and children who walk in these doors and you're battling something. There's a fight that's going on, and maybe you haven't shared that with anybody. Maybe you have, but maybe you haven't. There are people who walk in here, and they've been just beat up all week. They feel surrounded. It feels like everything that could go against them is going against them. Maybe it's relational. Maybe their marriage is just really struggling. Maybe they have a child that is just going crazy, doing things that they never thought that they would do, and it's just this relational disconnect that's there. Maybe it's financial. They don't know how they're going to make ends meet, and it's not even the end of the month yet, and they're still trying to figure out how they're going to make the ends meet for the next 10 or 11 days, 12 days that are going on the rest of this month. Maybe somebody walks in and they just got laid off. Maybe there's somebody else who walks in and they just got a bad report from the doctor. And we're all walking in and all this stuff. Maybe a kid walked in and just found out his parents are getting a divorce. Maybe a student walked in and they just found out that, hey, I didn't quite make the grades that I needed to this year, and I'm going to have to repeat this class or this class. And there's stuff going on, and we could just talk over and over and over again about all the issues and the things that are going on. But every single week, there are people who walk through these doors, and there are people who join from their home or wherever they're at online, and they've got these struggles that are going on. And when we walk in, and the band begins to play, and we begin to sing songs, We can get in the routine where we just are going through the motion. It's like, oh yeah, this is a song. I don't know this one. I'm not going to sing as much. Or I like this one, so I'm going to sing a little bit more, whatever. We're not doing it. That, as much love as I can offer. We're not singing songs to make you happy. We're not singing songs to make you feel good. If that happens, that's an added bonus. That's awesome. We're singing songs to God. We're singing songs to the one who is worthy. We're lifting our hands and our voices and our hearts to the one who is the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the great I am, the one who spoke this entire spinning orb into existence. That's who we're singing to. That's who we're lifting our hands and our hearts to. It's warfare. It's worship. It's God, you are great, and I can't figure out how I'm going to make it through this on my own, and I'm just going to lean in and trust in you. It makes no sense in the natural. It makes no sense in the physical. But I'm going to worship you. The Apostle Paul, in a letter to the Corinthian church, his second letter to the Corinthian church, he echoed this sentiment. Here's what he had to say. He said, "For though we live in the world, we don't wage war as the world does." Hey, even though we live in this world, we don't fight the way everybody else fights. The weapons that we fight with are not weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. Now, in this context, Paul is writing this letter to a group of Jesus followers in Corinth who, quite honestly, they're questioning his authority. They're calling him out. There's some division that's taking place in this young church. And he's written one letter correcting some issues, and he's writing this follow-up letter thanking them for listening, but he's saying, look, I know some of you are still trying to cause issues in the church. I know some of you are still trying to cause division. Let me just talk to you a minute. He could have leaned in to his earthly wisdom. He could have leaned into an earthly type of attack and said, look, I'm the guy because I started the church. You need to listen to me. He didn't do those things. He said, look, this battle that we're fighting, I'm not going to use earthly weapons. I'm going to worship God. I'm going to use the weapons in the Spirit to prove who I am and give my credence and my authority, my credentials. I'm not going to fight like the world fights. Instead, I'm going to choose to fight and let God fight this battle for me. I'm going to choose to fight by worshiping. I'm going to choose to fight by leaning into the Spirit and what He wants to do. And in your life and in mine, when those moments show up that we don't have an answer, we can't figure it out, maybe, just maybe, whether we feel like it or not, it's time to sing a song of worship. Maybe, just maybe, whether we feel it or we don't, we just lift our hands and just, whether you can sing or not, you just start to praise God. We just start to say, God, you're good. God, you're worthy. God, you're holy and righteous. You are magnificent. God, there is none like you. God, you are great. God, you are my God. And I give my all to you. And I don't understand what's going on in this moment. I can't fix this. But I trust you. I trust you. See, worship is taking the focus off of our problem and placing it on God. It's taking the focus off of that thing in front of us, that bad report, that hurt relationship, that struggle that we're experiencing, that financial difficulty. It's taking the focus off of that thing, and it's saying, God, I can't do this. All I know to do is to look up. All I know to do is to look to you. what you and I need to understand this morning is that the enemy that we face is no match for our worship. Or to put it more succinctly and put it more plainly and more perfectly, I feel like the enemy is no match for the object of our worship. There's no enemy that you and I face that can stand up to God. There's no enemy. There's no issue. There's no struggle. There's no diagnosis. There's no problem. There's no loss of job that can stand up to who He is. That sounds really good in practice, or in theory. It's hard to put it into practice sometimes, right? Because let's just be honest. We are a emotional group of people. We're an emotional being, right? We want to feel certain things, and unfortunately, we're led by our feelings a little too much. And so here's what happens sometimes. We've had a bad week. Maybe we woke up on the wrong side of the bed. Maybe the coffee wasn't the right temperature. And we had to eat oatmeal again for breakfast. And we walk in here on a Sunday morning, and we've got our arms crossed. And we just stand around. And the music's going on, and we're, when will this be over? And we just kind of go through the motions because we just don't feel it. Can I just tell you, your feelings should never be the director of your worship. Your feelings, my feelings, cannot be the litmus test of whether or not I'm going to worship or not, because chances are you're not going to feel it all the time. I'm not going to feel it all the time. But despite how I feel, He is still God. Despite how I feel, He is still good. Despite how I feel, He is still worthy of all the worship that I can give Him. That guy Paul we mentioned a little bit ago in his letter to the Corinthians, he experienced this firsthand. Dr. Luke wrote 2 portions of what we call our New Testament. He wrote the book of Luke. He also wrote the history of the early church in the book of Acts. He was Paul's companion. Some scholars believe because Paul was so sick, he needed to have a personal doctor with him all the time, because he just had so much stuff going on in his life. Luke traveled with him, and so he gives an account of the early church. And he tells the story of Paul and a guy named Silas who were arrested. And then they were beaten. And then they were put in chains in the innermost part of the jail. And as the story goes, after they had been severely flogged, were thrown into the prison, the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. Verse 25 in Acts chapter 16, about midnight, Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the other prisoners were listening. About midnight, after being imprisoned and beaten and locked in shackles in the innermost part of the prison, these guys didn't feel it. They didn't feel like it. And yet they continued to sing and pray to God. I can't imagine what they were singing, but they were giving praise to their God. And we continue, verse 26. Suddenly there was such a violent earthquake that the foundations of the prison were shaken. At once, the prison doors flew open, and everyone's chains came loose. Notice it doesn't just say Paul and Silas's chains fell loose and all the other prisoners were there watching. It said everyone's chains fell off. These men who didn't feel it, these men who were facing this difficulty, that they didn't have a way they were going to be able to get out. They didn't have the intellect, they didn't have the strength, they didn't have the money to be able to get out. And they just decided, hey, I'm going to sing and I'm going to pray and I'm going to worship my God. And chains began to fall. Maybe when you and I walk in this place and we worship, even when we don't feel it, it won't just be us that experiences the freedom. Maybe there's somebody that walked in this place and they're just really not at a place where they can lift up their hands and worship. They're not there yet. But when they see you worship, when they see me worship, when they experience authentic worship, someone who is crying out to God, worshiping Him even in the midst of a difficulty, maybe, just maybe, the chains that have them bound will begin to fall as well. Maybe, just maybe, the prison door that has them locked inside will start to open up. Maybe the foundations will be shaken. And life change will happen because you and because I decided we're going to worship regardless of what we feel. Regardless of how we faced stuff this week, regardless of what has been going on in our lives, we are going to choose to worship. And it may not just benefit you, and it may not just benefit me, it may benefit those around us. Worship proclaims the power of God over every situation that we face. Worship says, God, you are God in the good times. You are God in the bad times. You are God in the in-between times. You are God, and I trust you. One of the most powerful examples of worshiping God in the midst of a difficult situation I've ever witnessed in my life. I was young in ministry, had not even started serving at the first church where Haley and I were able to serve as student pastors. We were still at what we would consider, what Haley would consider her home church. I would consider my home church because that's where she grew up and it's where I really came to faith and announced a call into ministry. And our lead pastors had two children, an older son named Heath and a younger daughter named Ashley. Haley and Ashley were close in age. Heath and I were close in age. He had already moved out, was married, and was actually serving as a student pastor at a church in the Montgomery area of Alabama. We get a phone call one morning that Heath fell asleep while driving to work and ran under the back of a garbage truck and died almost instantly. Mike and Marley, our lead pastors, were beyond grieving. I can't imagine, as a parent, what that must have felt like. The funeral was held near the Montgomery area. That was where they were originally from. And so the church took church buses, and several of us drove down, and we wanted to be there to support our pastors during this really difficult time. The place was packed. It was a sanctuary of about 400 or 500 people, and it was standing room only. I mean, this affected the congregation. It affected the community just so much. The funeral was going on, and one of Heath's best friends sang a song at his funeral. And I had never heard the song before. This was a long time ago. The song was "I Can Only Imagine." It had just been released. He said this was Heath's favorite song. And so he stood on that stage and he sang, I Can Only Imagine. As the song's going on, it's a somber moment. It's a sad moment. And all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I see Mike and Marley stand to their feet, hands lifted, singing that song to the top of their lungs. Surrounded by your glory, what will my heart feel? Will I dance for you, Jesus, or in all of you be still? Will I stand in your presence, or to my knees will I fall? Will I sing hallelujah? Will I be able to speak at all? I can only imagine. And here these parents were at the funeral of their only son, hands lifted, worshiping Jesus in what had to be the most devastating moment of their lives. And that was a testimony to me and everyone in that building of where their hope was found. And they said, you know what? I don't understand. I want my son back. But God, you're good. God, you are good. And as a young man, I was maybe 21. That impacted me for life. Who knows, but maybe the worship that you offer could have that same impact in somebody's life. Who knows, but maybe in that difficult moment, you can sing and you can lift your hands. Somebody else can see that, and that will make Jesus famous, man. That will make him known. That will make him recognizable. That's why worship is at the core of what we do around here. It's warfare. It has the power to change lives. It has the potential to set people free. It has the potential to set you free. In just a moment, the band's going to come back and we're going to sing one final song. And I want to encourage you this morning. Not because I'm trying to work up some kind of emotional stuff. That's not me. That's not who I am. That's never who I'm going to be. But I want to encourage you this morning. Is worship important? Yeah, it's important. Why do we sing and engage in worship? Because we're all going through battles. And it takes our eyes off of the battle and places them back on Him. What does it accomplish? It brings freedom. It brings peace. It brings hope. It brings joy. It brings comfort. Worship is at the core of who we are and what we do at level 13. Because He's worthy. As we sing this morning, as we play this final song, I want to encourage you to worship. Now, that may look different for some of us. For some, it may be standing with hands lifted. For others, it may be sitting, contemplating, just meditating on God. For others, it may be hitting our knees. For some, it may be weeping. For some, it may be shouting. Whatever the case is, I want to encourage you, connect with God in worship this morning. Holy Spirit, would you come and do in this place what only you can do? We invite your presence here. You are welcome. come flood this place with your presence and help us as men and women of faith to lift our hands, our hearts, our voices to you for your glory and your great name.